So we're also going to explore cumulative effects of TRAP in this session, the environmental, social, and behavioral factors on disproportionately affected communities as well. And this session is intended to address some of the challenges and future research opportunities that have emerged from the findings of HEI's recently published Special Report number 23, the systematic review and meta-analysis of selected health effects of long-term exposure to traffic-related air pollution. So for this session, we are going to have each of the panelists come up and give a 15-minute presentation, followed by a 5-minute Q&A. And then at the end of all the presentations, we will also have time for a discussion, in addition with the audience and all the panelists. So first, I would like to introduce Rachel Muncrief from the International Council on Clean Transportation. And as a bio, so Rachel Muncrief is the Deputy Director of the International Council on Clean Transportation, where she works on the development and implementation of program strategies to eliminate the climate and health impacts of the transportation sector. So Rachel came to the ICCT from the University of Houston, where her research focused on NOx and PM emissions reduction for diesel applications and full-scale vehicle and engine testing of heavy-duty vehicle technologies and fuels. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering with a focus in catalysis and reactor engineering from Tulane University. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Muncrief.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. Before I just get really into it, I want to let you know a little bit more about my organization. I'm not sure if everyone is too familiar with the ICCT. We are a small, relatively small, about 150 staff globally, nonprofit organization, and we're mission-driven, just like a lot of nonprofits, and our main mission is to reduce and ideally eventually eliminate all of the climate and health impacts from the transportation sector globally. So it's a good mission. And we really do that by focusing on doing technical work to support really sound policymaking and regulations by governments. And it's a really, really interesting time, obviously, to be working in the transportation space. We currently have 150 years built up of fossil fuel infrastructure and technology, and just within a few short decades, if we want to align with, the Paris climate targets, we have to completely transition the transportation sector to be based on clean and renewable energy. So my goal here with this presentation is to just sort of give a lay of the land, what's going on with the technologies, what's going on with the policies, internationally, and how does this transition to clean and renewable transportation link to all of the great work that you're doing on the health side. So let me just get started with this figure. This is sort of our key figure that we're constantly updating, and let me just walk you through it really quickly. So if you look at, this is kind of our figure. It gives us the gut check, like how are we doing in terms of how are we doing in terms of the transportation sector aligning with Paris climate targets, which, as you know, is well below 2 degree, ideally a 1.5 degree pathway. And this is just, I should say, this is just for on-road transport. We work in all modes of transportation. The stuff I'm going to be talking about here is just cars, vans, trucks, and buses, so the kind of the on-road sector. So this top one is the baseline. This represents all of the existing regulations that have already been put in place. This is the trajectory we can expect with the existing regulations. The next is that purple wedge. That purple wedge represents proposed regulations or government commitments that haven't yet been put into regulatory binding form. Then the next two, those darker blue and lighter blue wedges, represent what we believe is the ICT based on what we know about technology, the ability for policy to drive things, the cost of technology. That's what we believe under an ambitious yet feasible situation could also happen in terms of electrification. And you can see when you add all of those three up together, you can get the on-road sector on a below 2 degree pathway, just barely. But there's a big, big gap between the below 2 degree scenario and where we need to be if we want to stay in a 1.5 degree compatible scenario. So electrification on its own is not going to be enough to get us there. We need other policies, we need other measures. Things like avoid and shift, we need maybe faster fleet renewal, we need to improve the efficiency of the ICE vehicles that are remaining to be sold. The other thing that is really interesting now, historically we've been working on government regulations. We typically work with policymakers. They're making incremental improvements to the emissions targets for a vehicle or the efficiency targets for a vehicle. These are not big, historically had not been big political sort of decisions. But that has changed. Now we're talking about transitioning to a completely new set of technologies. So this requires like another aspect to our work, and that is getting that political buy-in at the highest levels of government. So right now, if you look at where governments have committed to actually phasing out internal combustion engines by 2035, 1 in 4 new car and van sales worldwide are covered by those kind of government, official government commitments. And there's more that's not even shown on this map. There's a number of other, let's say, less binding, less official commitments, such as some announcements from COP26, or commitments that don't fully go out to zero. Also not shown here is on the heavy-duty side, there's a number of governments that are committing to phasing out and moving towards zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles as well. And this shows where we actually are in EV sales in some of the key major markets where a lot of the vehicles are currently sold. So it's kind of exciting. If you look, you can see the sort of solid line starting in 2015 through 2022. Those are actual EV sales in these major markets. You can see in 2022, China had 28% EV sales, and then even in California, UK, Europe, they were all in the above 20%. US is about 7% on average in 2022. But then the dotted lines moving forward show where we're going based on regulatory action in these countries. So looking at Europe and California, they have both finalized regulations to have no more ICE sales by 2035 in those markets. The UK, if I had shown this chart just a few weeks ago, you wouldn't even see the UK and the US on here. UK and US just recently came out with proposals, UK going all the way out to 2035. Notably, UK coming in with a stronger proposal than what's happening in Europe, so maybe a little Brexit silver lining there. They have a 80% in 2030 interim target in their proposal. The US not going all the way out to a full phase out and not going all the way out to 2035, but their 2032 target in the current proposal takes us to 67% EV sales in 2032, which is sort of aligned with where Europe's going. Notably, China, they do not have any long-term proposal or standards out there, even though they are the world's leading EV market. And it's not just cars and vans, it's also trucks. Again, if I had shown this slide probably just a few weeks ago, it would actually only have California on there. I don't know how much you guys are following this, but on Friday, this previous Friday, California actually finalized their regulation, and as of in 2036, it'll be all zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles being sold in California from that point on. The US and the EU just recently came out with proposals to that will really, really accelerate the adoption of zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles. The US proposal going out just to 2032, again, sort of like aligned with what they proposed for light-duty vehicles, and the EU one going out further. And this one's obviously a little bit more messy because heavy-duty vehicles are more segmented. So buses, it's going to be easier to electrify buses earlier. When you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum with the heavy-duty long-haul trucks, those are going to take a little bit longer. So the regulation is going to account for that. But of course, it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. We have to keep ratcheting down criteria pollutants, especially from heavy-duty diesels. I think I don't have to tell everyone in this room, that's a major, major source of really negative health impacts. Even in markets that sort of have the latest and greatest, let's say Euro 6 emission standards, the PM 2.5, the NOx emissions coming out of those vehicles in real-world driving are significantly higher than you would think based on just looking at the standard or the target and the regulation. And it's even more accentuated in urban areas where the vehicles are driving more slowly. So I guess, you know, US and Europe are moving, and California, of course, are moving forward with the next level, ratcheting down even further on NOx emissions. This is totally possible on technology. It's also cost effective when you look at a cost analysis. And this will even further have significant impacts on the health impacts from heavy duty diesels. But, you know, it's not happening all over the world. You can see in this chart, you know, some markets are much, much further behind. One of the things that really slows down the adoption of some of these cleaner technologies is the quality of the fuel that is available in these markets. And just to give you an example, the fuel, the ultra low sulfur diesel fuel is just not readily available in a number of the key markets that are experiencing really the worst health impacts from heavy duty diesel emissions, and that's in Northwest and Central Africa, in areas of Southeast Asia and Central and South America. And we actually took a look, this study's a couple years old at this point, but I think it still stands. We actually took a look, like, what would be the added health impacts of countries moving, if they haven't already moved to Euro 6, and then, again, even moving to Euro 7, like I mentioned, the ultra-low standards that the US and Europe are now putting forward. And it would be really, really significant. So I just wanted to point out, in this study, we looked at the combination of just the emission standards, and then what if we look at the emission standards plus also kind of trying to renew that fleet a little bit faster than would normally happen. And what we found is that, you know, if all the countries that don't already have it can move to Euro 6, that can cumulatively save more than 1 million premature deaths between 2020 and 2050, and it would be 4 million if we can move to Euro 7 in that time frame. I just also wanted to have a quick note about cities, because I know, you know, a lot of the emissions are happening in urban areas. The cities are really dealing with the brunt of that, and the cities have really gotten creative in different measures to kind of tackle these issues. So one of the statistics I always think is really interesting is, you know, we talk about pretty much the bulk of EV sales are happening in US, Europe, and China, but when you drill down even to the next level, the bulk of EV sales are happening in 25 metro areas. So 30%, this was data from 2020, but it still stands, a third of EV sales are happening in just 25 metro areas. And those metro areas represent only 13% of global EV sales and only 4% of the world's population. So why is that? It's because of the things that cities are doing. They're putting in incentives, they're putting in the infrastructure that's needed, and they're putting in policies like these low emission zones, zero emission zones that sort of restrict those higher emitting vehicles and from coming into the city or certain parts of the city, and ideally eventually are only going to allow the zero emitting vehicles in. This map here shows cities that are actually implementing zero emission zones, which is mostly happening in Europe. So just my two last slides. Now we talked about the policies, talked a little bit about the technology. I kind of want to link this a little bit more to the health impact. So one thing that we've done at ICT is we always want to look at the life cycle impact of the vehicle. So this is a study, and we've done this analysis in many different ways for many different specific markets or specific vehicle types. This is sort of like an average result here that I want to show. And it basically shows, you know, what is the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of various vehicle technologies. So first, if you start from the left, and we tried to cover, the manufacturing of the vehicle, the maintenance of the vehicle, the in-use phase of the vehicle, et cetera. So if you start from the left, we look at sort of your typical fossil fuel vehicles. We've got gasoline vehicle, diesel, and natural gas. Then moving a little bit more to the right, you've got the plug-in hybrid that gives you some benefit. And then you get additional benefit from a battery electric vehicle. Now this, important to note, is for vehicles, this was actually for vehicles being sold in 2021. So this takes into account how the grid is going to change and mature over the lifetime that the vehicle is going to be on the road. Don't forget, most of the vehicles that are being sold today are going to be on the road for 15, 18 plus years. And over that time, the grid will be changing. And then also fuel cell vehicles. Now, this next figure shows a little bit more. So this would be like, what about a vehicle that's sold in 2030 over the lifetime of that vehicle? Well, the emissions from the fossil fuel vehicles obviously are not going to change that much over the life cycle, but the vehicles from the battery electric side are going to come way down because the grid is going to be improving in that time frame. And then if you just look at, I guess it's the third one from the right, if you have a battery electric vehicle fully charged by fully renewables, the emissions are like 80% lower on a life cycle basis. And you'll notice that yellow bar, that is the greenhouse gas emissions from the added greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturer of the battery. So we do, once we get to this stage where we have renewable energy and we have electric vehicles, the next thing that we're really working on, and we're already working on that today, is how do we get that manufacturing emissions down? We got to cut emissions from battery manufacturers, and we really have to cut emissions from the steel industry. So how does that link? So I don't have a chart like this that shows the life cycle emissions of PM 2.5, but what I do have is, this is my last slide, and it's the emissions of the health impacts from just going to electric vehicles. So this was a study that we actually did a couple years ago looking at India. You guys may or may not know, India has one of the dirtiest grids in the world, coal. So we did a study to look at, like, okay, let's see, what if India doesn't do anything about their grid and just goes for electrification? Are there going to be actually like health benefits to doing that? And the answer is actually yes. Those are the red lines. The red lines at the top show the health benefits of literally just going to electrification and not doing anything on the grid side. And then as you start to like do more on the grid side, the benefits obviously increase substantially. So, this is how I'm thinking about linking the benefits of electric vehicles. We already can see that there's clearly a huge benefit on the greenhouse gas side, but there's also going to be a huge benefit on the health side. And I hope this could kind of set the stage for the discussions that we're about to have. Okay. Thanks.
So we have time for one question for Dr. Muncrief.
It's not necessary.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mikhail's coming up.
Okay.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Thank you for the presentation, quite kind of sobering. Has your analysis included impact of the old cars, second-hand cars exported to countries which have no standards? Electric vehicles and all those improved vehicles will dominate in the markets of some countries, but cars produced now will survive and will go somewhere else. I mean, unless there are policies to scrap those old cars. So has your analysis included this?
Yes. Nothing I specifically showed here. I mean, I would say, like, for example, the life cycle analysis I showed here considers the entire life cycle of the vehicle. So we understand that, a vehicle might start out in one country and end up in another country. So that part was included. But I will say it is a major issue, the exportation of sort of dirtier vehicles. And there's a lot of these kind of flows that we're seeing. So we see, exporting vehicles, let's say, from the Western countries to the global South. We have a lot of exports from Europe to Western Africa, these kind of flows. are not good because it's basically just like exporting the issue. So we're looking at policies. What can the exporting countries do? And then what can the importing countries do? So the exporting countries, we are working, like, for example, in Europe, they're thinking about putting in place regulations where they're not going to necessarily be allowed to export dirty vehicles. They have to, like you said, scrap them and get rid of them. The importing countries can also put in place rules. They can say, like, we're only going to import vehicles that meet a certain standard, X, Y, and Z. There's a number of measures that they can put in place as well. So I think, again, we work on policy, we work on regulation, and I think that there's a number of things in the works that are, trying to help fix this issue. It's a massive issue. It's good to point it out.
Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Regan Patterson. She is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on the intersection of air quality, sustainable transportation, and environmental justice. She uses air quality models to quantify traffic-related air pollution emissions and concentrations in urban disenfranchised communities. Dr. Patterson earned her PhD in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome.
Good morning. I am coming to you from California, so it's a little early, but we're going to get through this together. So, thank you. So, I'm honored to present among such thought leaders today for the HEI annual conference. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Regan Patterson, and I am a pretty new assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at UCLA, and the principal investigator of the Engineering Environmental Justice Lab. We are on socials. My research, as mentioned, focuses on that intersection of air quality engineering, sustainable transportation, and environmental justice. And more specifically, I examine and model the impact of transportation policies and place-based community-driven interventions on air pollution exposure disparities and environmental justice. And I always like to start by saying that my research is really inspired by grassroots organizing, particularly the work of Black environmental justice organizers fighting for and imagining a new world conducive to livable Black futures. And that work is really rooted in history for that fight for livable Black futures. And so with that, the title of my talk today is Environmental Justice and Other Implications of New Transportation on Traffic-Related Air Pollution and Health. And I share this photo now as a preview of the very real lived experiences at that intersection of each aspect: environmental justice, other implications, which we'll discuss, new transportation and new mobilities, and traffic-related air pollution. So in terms of environmental justice, racial ethnic disparities and exposure to traffic-related air pollution are well documented. And so this figure is from a recent study that found average census tract level NO2 disparities across 52 cities, for the upper left being for Black communities, then Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous peoples, compared to non-Hispanic whites. And the study found that low-income people of color are exposed to 28% higher NO2 than high-income non-Hispanic whites. Another recent study found that people of color experience a 14% disparity in fine particulate matter exposure, and heavy-duty diesel vehicles are among the largest sources of racial ethnic disparity in exposure to fine PM. Disproportionate exposures contribute to disparate health impacts, including racial ethnic disparities in asthma, preterm birth, cancer risk, and mortality. So I'm going to touch upon a few policies that were previously mentioned, so I'm liking this kind of continual thread. So last December, the EPA adopted the Control of Air Pollution from New Motor Vehicles, Heavy-Duty Engines and Vehicle Standards rule that reduces NO2 emissions from heavy-duty vehicles and engines starting in model year 2027. This rule is the first step of the Clean Trucks Plan, and so phase 2 of the proposal to update heavy-duty greenhouse gas emissions for model year 2027 was just released a couple of weeks ago, as mentioned. And the EPA, as seen in this figure here, predicts that by 2045, the rule will reduce NOx emissions from the in-use fleet of heavy-duty trucks by approximately 50% and result in air quality improvements. But to really help us understand and glean lessons about the impacts on environmental justice, I turned to my study on California's adoption of newer and cleaner engines. So to comply with the more stringent emission standards, exhaust after treatment control systems like those seen here have become standard equipment on new engines. These include diesel particle filters for PM control and selective catalytic reduction systems for NOx control. But since heavy-duty diesel vehicles have a long service life, as was previously mentioned, natural fleet turnover results in the slow replacement of these older trucks with the newer and cleaner engine models over a timescale of several decades. And so near-term reductions in pollutant emissions can only be achieved with additional end-use regulations that address these existing emissions. So in California, such end-use regulations accelerate the adoption of control systems. For instance, California rules require all heavy-duty diesel engines to have the diesel particle filters by 2018 and to have both DPFs and SCR actually by this year. And so several studies have quantified the emissions benefit of the control strategies, but none have analyzed the impacts on environmental justice. So the objectives of my study that I did during my dissertation were to estimate the impact of this accelerated deployment on NOx, diesel PM, and black carbon emissions, to model the effect of emission changes on near roadway air pollution, and to evaluate the environmental justice implications. And I conducted the study in the East Oakland Freight Corridor. It's an extreme example, but the East Oakland Freight Corridor is traversed by two major interstate freeways, I-880 and I-580, as shown here. I-880 supports intra-regional freight transport in the East Bay and connects to an inter-regional network that provides access, as you see, between the Port of Oakland, the Oakland International Airport, and then extends to the rest of the state and the US. In contrast, trucks are actually prohibited along a segment of I-580 in East Oakland, indicated by the thick red line. Is anyone here from the Bay Area? So you all know about this? And so as a consequence, all truck traffic, including port and airport-related cargo movement, must travel on the I-880. And so this is really a result of differential access to power. And so the two study areas that are adjacent to these two freeways are Brookfield Village and Sabranti Park along I-880 and Sequoia along I-580. And so I selected Brookfield Village and Sabranti Park because at the time the US EPA was actually doing a study at Brookfield Elementary School, which is directly adjacent to I-880, on a mitigation strategy that included tree planting. So accelerated adoption of filters on heavy-duty trucks in California were phased in between January of 2010 and December 2017, and SCR was through December of 2022. And so I selected the years of 2009, 2018, and 2023. This was done before this year, so now it would be interesting to do an actual measurement study for the before and after points of comparison. And so I predicted near roadway concentrations using the R-line line source dispersion model. And briefly, modeling results did show rapid emission reductions. However, disparities persist, particularly for NOx. And this really supports the transition to cleaner transportation options, such as electrified freight. But further, results of the study are based on the assumption that control systems remain in good working order. And the EPA rule even acknowledges this and addresses this tampering and poor maintenance by actually requiring manufacturers to design engines to prevent operators from reprogramming the engines to bypass or disable controls, known as tampering. And it also requires the engines to provide more advanced notice than that the SCR system isn't working properly. So really, it's important to note that the justice benefits of any of these diesel truck emission controls actually rely on the proper functioning of exhaust after treatment control systems or the replacement of diesel engines with alternatives, such as electric batteries or fuel cells. In fact, on March 31st, as also was mentioned, the US EPA approved California's rule requiring half of heavy-duty trucks to be sold to be electric vehicles by 2035. And it is May Day, and as an environmental justice scholar, I think it's also important to mention that these costs really fall on independent contractors. So when we're asking people to buy $100,000 new diesel tractors, if we're asking folks to buy $200,000 or more new electric trucks, that is falling on independent contractor truck drivers. So I do want to note that as we discuss labor and it being May Day, which is an important day for international labor workers. Additionally, disparities will continue to persist until all vehicles have zero tailpipe emissions due to racial discrimination in planning. So a recent study on the effect of COVID-19 lockdowns on NO2 disparities found that neighborhoods with large proportions of non-white residents saw the largest decreases in NO2 pollution after reductions in passenger vehicle activity, but racial ethnic disparities still persisted, and this was partially due to the proximity to roadways. And so the study found that the least white tracts have a road density of 4.5 times higher than the most white tracts. And again, this is due to racial discrimination in planning. Additionally, even if we did eliminate tailpipe emissions, there remains other emission sources. The two that I'll highlight today are non-exhaust emissions and auto manufacturing. So non-exhaust PM emissions. As the transition to EVs reduce tailpipe emissions, non-exhaust emissions will become an increasingly important source of traffic-related PM emissions. And unlike exhaust emissions, I'm saying emissions a lot, non-exhausts are largely unregulated because they're very hard to control. And so the impact of electrification on non-exhaust emissions will actually be influenced by two things: regenerative braking systems and vehicle weight. So regenerative braking systems, who here has a hybrid or an electric? So you all know what regenerative braking is. That reduces brake wear. However, EVs weigh more than similar gasoline vehicles, which increases tire wear, road wear, and resuspension. And so this issue is exacerbated by our consumer preferences for larger vehicles and greater driving range. Who has a truck? Nobody raised their hand that time. So without targeted policies, some studies actually suggest that increased vehicle weight of electric vehicles will increase non-exhaust emissions great enough for electrification to have little effect on total traffic-related PM10 and PM2.5 emissions by mass. Secondly, that I'll highlight is auto manufacturing. For this, I'll give you an example. Anyone here from Detroit, Michigan? Detroit in the house. So the Stellantis Detroit Assembly Complex is the first new vehicle assembly plant in Detroit for 30 years. It opened with the promise of what? Jobs. And the low-emission hybrid car plant has been issued several air quality violations already from the Michigan Department of Environment. All of the census tracts surrounding the plant are in the 90th percentile for asthma rates in the nation. The US EPA has launched a civil rights investigation to determine if there was racial discrimination in the emissions permit approval. So pollution from production sites may actually exacerbate environmental injustice in Black and brown communities. Which brings me back to another issue with auto manufacturing sites. And that brings me to this image and story of farmer and logger Marvin Sanderlin and his sons Matthew and Joseph. They are fighting against the Tennessee Department of Transportation in an eminent domain lawsuit. So Ford is building a new electric truck plant in rural Tennessee. And the state is planning to build a road that connects the Ford plant to the interstate, but the path goes through Black farms in Tipton, Haywood, and Fayette counties, which includes Sanderlin's land. Some of this land was passed down by enslaved folks who were able to fight to obtain their land, as well as sharecroppers. But racial discrimination and accessing federal farm loans has gained attention, particularly with the Farm Bill. But now these same Black farmers are facing something reminiscent of freeway construction dispossession for our clean transportation future. So an equitable future requires transformative solutions that prioritize environmental justice and infrastructure equity. And if you know me, you know I'm going to talk about reconnecting communities. So one such solution is the Reconnecting Communities program. The bipartisan infrastructure law invests $1 billion to reconnect communities, and the Inflation Reduction Act provides an additional $3 billion for neighborhood access and equity grants. The $1 billion for the Reconnecting Communities program is divided into two areas: $250 million for planning grants and $750 million for capital construction grants. Planning grants provide funding for planning studies, community engagement activities, and a technical assistance program. And this funding area builds off of the work started by former Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx, who was really the first Transportation Secretary to formally recognize the inequitable racial and economic impacts of freeways. And so winners of Foxx's Every Place Counts design challenge receive technical assistance for freeway teardown or capping projects. Then on the other hand, capital construction grants provide funding for the actual removal, retrofit, or mitigation of infrastructure and its replacement with infrastructure that restores connectivity. And I'm almost done because I know I'm over time. So while the Reconnecting Communities program is novel in that it directs federal funding towards freeway removal projects, it's not novel in concept. And so there's precedent, as there are several completed projects as shown here, taken from the Congress for the New Urbanisms webpage including the Big Dig, the one that you see on the top left, right here in Boston. And for now, I'd like to briefly highlight the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco. Anybody been here? Yes. So anybody know it used to be a double-decker highway? So the Embarcadero Freeway provides an example of a freeway that was torn down without a replacement route. And I want to highlight this to, one, emphasize that that is really the goal, removal, and two, to demonstrate that it is possible. So in February, the US DOT announced $185 million in awards for 45 projects, including 6 capital construction grants and 39 planning grants. And nearly half of funding went to proposals to cap freeways, but a quarter did go to proposals to remove freeways or other barriers to connectivity. So tying this all together, I conclude by emphasizing that the transition to zero tailpipe emission vehicles must be coupled with transformative solutions if we are going to actually achieve environmental justice. And it will take research done by folks like us to analyze the impact of these such solutions and their true impact. Thank you.
So I'd like to ask if there are questions for Dr. Patterson.
Perhaps I could start. Dr. Patterson, the East Oakland Freight Corridor, which you mentioned to us, is this a pilot scheme, or is it something which has been brought in and will effectively be there forever?
Oh, in terms of the part that cannot be accessed by
Yes,
trucks?
yes.
So that's codified. So it's the only interstate freeway that is codified into law that there's no trucks allowed. And so that was due to advocacy. At the time, when it was initially introduced, you can think of the differential, the difference in demographics. So it was white neighborhood compared to the flats, which was low-income communities of color. So they were able to advocate when the roadway, MacArthur Roadway, got turned into the freeway. They were able to advocate. But then after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, trucks couldn't go on the I-80, so they had to start going on 580. Residents were like, oh, heck no. And so then they took it to the state, and the state actually codified it.
And has an air quality benefit been seen?
Oh, over there?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you can just see the difference in air quality between the Oakland Hills versus the flats. So.
Hi, Chad Bailey from EPA. Fascinating talk. Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the independent contractors, dray truck drivers, probably others. You know, we've heard, you know, a couple different ways to approach the problem. You know, obviously these people are poor and they keep fixing their trucks over and over and over again because they can do it. What do you do for those? You know, what do we do for those people? Is this clean up the new trucks and then eventually things trickle down, or is there? Have you heard of solutions that are faster than that?
Yeah, so there's a great report by the UC Berkeley Labor Center that addresses this, as well as one of the reports that I wrote when I was a research policy fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And so a lot of this work is targeted funding. And so, for instance, in California, there's regional air districts, and the regional air districts provide funding. So I had the opportunity to be an intern at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And so one of their things was providing funding for fleets to turn over their fleet and accelerate fleet turnover. The challenge, though, is who can apply for that funding. And so if you are a larger company, you have that staff who's able to write the proposal to then get the funding. But it's harder for these smaller companies and, again, these individual owner-operators to really get that funding. So if we can target it towards the most vulnerable to make sure that folks have that funding assistance, that would be one. And so taking these funding kind of measures that are in existence, even at the federal level, oh my goodness, you're at the EPA, what's the federal, DARA. So, oh, I saw the eyes, there's some. So there is funding for that, but again, making sure we target funding to those smaller operations that employ less individuals than these big kind of conglomerates that can really afford to do and submit these applications. Yeah. So happy May Day, y'all. Labor rights, labor justice, and environmental justice.
Thank you to Dr. Patterson.
Well, good morning, everyone. We continue now with our third presentation in this session. It's from Professor Mette Sørensen. Mette is a senior researcher at the Danish Cancer Society Research Centre. She holds a PhD in environmental epidemiology from Copenhagen University, and her main research area is investigation of health effects exposure to transportation noise in large cohorts. Mette, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank, and also thank you very much to the Health Effects Institute for inviting me here today to present some of our results from the HEI study. Today I will focus on our results on traffic-related air pollution and health, and also come into this complex interplay with especially road traffic noise, but also other potential confounders. So our study population is the entire Danish population. You heard about that this morning, so you will know that we have free healthcare in all of Denmark, and we also have some really unique registers. So just repeat for those who wasn't there this morning. In this study, we included the entire Danish population of more than 50 years of age. We followed up for diseases between 2005 and 2017, which actually gave us a population around 2 million persons. And in Denmark, everybody gets this social security card that you see below, the yellow card. And there's a 10-digit number, which we use to link between all the administrative and health registries that we have in Denmark. So a very important registry is this CPR registry, which actually holds complete address history for all people living in Denmark, dating actually all the way back to the 70s. And we sent all these addresses, or we geocoded them, and we sent them to Aarhus University, which estimated air pollution and also green space at all these addresses. We also sent it to a noise consultant, which estimated road traffic noise at all these addresses. And then we used 3 different health registries to identify who actually developed disease in our population. So these 3 registries are the hospital registry, the mortality registry, and the prescription registry. And based on these registries, we were able to identify 130,000 that developed type 2 diabetes, and a little more than 70,000 that developed MI, and also almost 100 persons that developed stroke during our follow-up period. We were also able to link with a number of registries at the Statistic Denmark, which holds this information on a number of socioeconomic variables. So we were able to get information for all persons in our population on income, yearly income, so we're able to adjust over the years. Also yearly education, marital status, occupation, and ethnicity. So we estimated air pollution using the DEM-UBM-ERGIS modeling system, which is a multi-scale deterministic model, which estimates air pollution at 3 levels: the regional level, the urban level, and the street level. It's, you can see how that works in the figure to the right. And we do that based on a number of input variables in this study, of course, all the geocoded addresses, which actually goes back to 5 years before we started follow-up, which ensured that we had at least 5 years of mean exposure to everybody in this cohort. Input variables to the model is also emission inventories, meteorology, transportation, dispersion, and chemistry. And today I will show you the results for 3 different pollutants, air pollutants, ultrafine particles, PM2.5, and NO2. So a few more words on these emissions inventories. These emission inventories are classified in 11 different groups, and group number 7, the SNAP 7, it contains emissions from road transport, and we use that to estimate exposure to traffic-related air pollution and also non-traffic related air pollution, which were the sum of all the other codes. So here you see some baseline characteristics of our study, and it's separated with those exposed to low and high ultrafine particles. And I think what is interesting here is that if you look, for example, on income and education, you can see that it is the persons with highest income and highest education that are actually, or these are more frequent among the persons exposed to high levels of ultrafine particles. And I can understand it's different here in the US, but in Denmark, this is what we expect because it's so popular to live very centrally in Denmark. So people with high education and high income will live very centrally in some of the large cities. And here you see the mean exposures for 3 air pollutants during follow-up, PM2.5, ultrafine particles, and NO2. And as you can see, we have relatively low levels of air pollution in Denmark. And also, I think it's interesting just to see that if we look on the concentration from the non-traffic compared to the traffic contribution, we can see that the non-traffic part consists of, it contributes much more than the traffic part, especially for PM2.5, a bit lesser for ultrafine particles and NO2. So to the result, first of all, these are the results for diabetes, and you see all results are presented per interquartile range and analyzed using Koch's proportional hazard models. And first here you see the results for our 3 pollutants, both the total contribution but also non-traffic and traffic in the unadjusted model, or only adjusted for age, sex, and year. And you can see that we find some association but not strong. But when we then adjust for all these individual level confounders like education, income, as well as also a number of area level socioeconomic status confounders, you can see that the hazard ratios goes up. And interestingly, for ultrafine particles, we find that the association is stronger for the traffic-related air pollution compared to the non-traffic, whereas for PM2.5 and NO2, it's quite similar. And here you can just see the dose-response relationship for PM2.5 and ultrafine particles. What we also tried to do was to do a 2-pollutant model, including both the non-traffic and the traffic contribution. And when we did this, you can see that both for PM2.5 and ultrafine particles, we found the strongest association for the traffic-related air pollution. Whereas for NO2, we didn't see, we saw similar size risk estimates. So these are the results then for cardiovascular diseases. As I mentioned in the beginning, we were looking at 2 different types of cardiovascular diseases, the myocardial infarction and the stroke. And here we found this is the adjusted models, and we found associations again with all of our 3 exposures. But interestingly, here we actually found strongest association with the non-traffic related contribution, whereas basically you can see, for example, for PM2.5, we didn't find any associations. And also, it's interesting that we actually found the same for both myocardial infarction and stroke. So for both of these, stronger association with the non-traffic part of air pollution. So just a few words on residual confounding from lifestyle, because in these administrative studies that we are doing, we are always concerned of whether there might be some residual confounding for lifestyle. So we aim to investigate this in a large Danish cohort that we have with 250,000 persons, where we have information on self-reported questionnaire data on lifestyle. So here you can see these results for MI and stroke and diabetes, and we looked at PM2.5 and NO2 here. And what is interesting here to look at is the difference between Model 2 and Model 3. In Model 2, we adjusted for all the variables that I just showed you in the national cohort. So this is adjusted for all the socioeconomic variables like education and income. In Model 3, we then also add these lifestyle variables like smoking, diet, physical activity, and BMI. And what's interesting to see here is that we don't see any effect on the risk estimates, or only minor effects, which suggests that the residual confounding from lifestyle is of minor concern in this study. So now I will move on to the results from our multi-pollutant study. As I already show, and also a lot of other studies have shown, air pollution is associated with diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but also a number of studies have shown that the same is the case for road traffic noise. So road traffic noise is also associated with higher risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and green space is also suspected of this, or lack of green space. And we know that these three exposures coexist in urban environments, so what we don't know is the effect size when all of these are taken into account at the same time. So therefore, we estimated road traffic noise at all our addresses using a really high quality exposure model called the Nordic prediction method. And we estimated not only noise at the most exposed facade, which is kind of the general way of estimating noise. We also estimated noise at the least exposed facade, which we see as a proxy for the noise exposure during sleep, which is one of the pathways that we expect that noise are harmful through. So, and we think this is a good proxy for this because we know that people that actually have access to a room facing away from a busy street will choose that this would be their sleeping room. So if we look on these maps here, you can see from Copenhagen, the capital, in Denmark, you can see for the most exposed facade, we can easily see the roads and that it's very noisy in the center of Copenhagen. But when we look at the least exposed facade, you can see that actually Copenhagen gets rather silent, and that's because we have these closed courtyards where it's actually quite silent. So we also estimated green space, or actually lack of green space for all our addresses. We estimated two different proxies. We estimated we estimated green space within 1,000 meters and also within 150 meters of each address. And you can see the resolution on the map to your right. For example, in red, you can see the houses, single-family houses, and in green, you can see the gardens around. So what are the correlations between these exposures? Actually, we find the highest correlation within air pollution exposure, whereas if we look at, for example, air pollution in relation to noise, we see only low to moderate correlations. And for this non-green or lack of green space, we see also only low to moderate or even no correlation with one of the proxies. So to the results, first of all, here you see the results for diabetes, and again, all results are giving per interquartile range increase. And in this multipollutant model, we have 6 different exposures. We have ultrafine particles, we have NO2, we have the 2 noise proxies, and the 2 lack of green space proxies. And what you can see to the right are then the results, the hazard ratios, both in single exposure models, that is in gray, and also in multipollutant models, that is in black. And I think there are 2 important take-home messages, I think, from this figure. First of all, it's evident that for all the exposures in this multipollutant model, the results or the hazard ratios for the single exposure in the single exposure models are much higher than in the multipollutant exposure. So definitely the hazard ratio drops when all the other exposures are included. But I think it's the second thing that is important is that even though all of them are in the model, we still see actually independent effect of both the air pollutants, the noise pollutants, and green space. So here are the similar results for MI. Here we have PM2.5 ultrafine particles, and again both NOx proxies and green space proxies, and basically the results are the same here. To check that you were still awake, I shifted the colors. So the single pollutants are now in black and the multi-pollutants are in gray. But you will see the same trends that in single pollutant models, you have higher risk estimates than in multi-pollutant models. But again, both air pollution, noise, and green space were associated with higher risk for MI in these in the multi-pollutant models. Okay, so to conclude, we found that adjustment for socioeconomic status is really important when we investigate air pollution and health. But we also found that after comprehensive adjustment for these socioeconomic variables, we found actually little or actually no residual confounding from lifestyle. We found that all of our 3 exposures to air pollution were associated with both diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But for diabetes, we found strongest association with particulate matter from traffic sources, whereas for cardiovascular disease, both for stroke and MI, we found strongest association with the non-traffic sources. We found in our multi-pollutant models that both particulate air pollution, road traffic noise, and green space were independently associated with all our 3 outcomes. And I think this is really important, we found higher risk estimates in single pollutant models compared to multi-pollutant model, and that actually means that if you estimate the effect of only one of these exposures, for example, only air pollution without adding in the others, you will actually overestimate the effect of that exposure. So with this, I will say thank you, and also thank you very much to HEI for funding this study.
Thank you, Mette. We have time for questions. Thank you.
Hi, John Wall from Cummins. This answer may be very obvious to people in epidemiology and medicine, but not to mechanical engineer. Are there hypotheses for cause and effect for association of particulates for noise with some of the myocardial infarction, diabetes, that sort of thing? You know, we had very clear connections between compounds identified in diesel particulate with mutagenicity and then connection then to carcinogenicity. So I'm curious about, in this space, are there similar cause and effect connections that you can articulate?
Yes, for noise. We know that noise during daytime, that stresses us, inducing the stress response with increased levels of cortisol and other hormones. But we also know, and we think maybe this is at least important, if you're exposed to noise during night, then your sleep will be disturbed. And we know from a number of studies, for example, on diabetes, that if you have a poor sleep, then you will have a higher risk for diabetes. And there's also been made a number of both animal studies, but also studies in the laboratory where you are exposing people during night for noise, and you see many of these cardiovascular risk factors increase after just one night where you sleep noisy.
Okay, thanks. That makes me think I need to snore less.
That's a really common question to get, whether we adjusted for snoring, but we didn't.
Hi, this is Evi Samoli from the HEI Research Committee. Just a question, if in the multi-exposure analysis you consider source-specific pollution as you do in the previous analysis you presented, and if the differential impact of sources on the outcomes was retained in the multi-exposure analysis, if you looked into it?
Yeah, so you're asking whether we also tried to do the same with the traffic and the non-traffic contribution. We did, and we obtained very similar results. Again, for the traffic contribution, which we found strongest associated with diabetes, we saw still that there was an effect of the 2 others also in the multi-pollutant model. So we find quite similar results.
Right. Zoran, yeah, we know each other. Thanks for very nice results. Can you elaborate 2 things on the non-traffic sources? So this is very interesting. What are they? Are they modeling about wood burning, something we really want to know more about in Denmark? And second, on the confounding in the sub-cohort, you see increase in estimates when you adjust for individual level in SCS. This is opposite what we saw in our cohorts earlier. If you can elaborate a little bit, how could that be explained? And, yeah.
Okay, so if we start about the socioeconomic, it's kind of obvious because what we see in this descriptive data, you could see that it was the highly exposed that were more likely to be highly educated and have a high income. So that would kind of be what we would suspect when we add it in as an adjustment parameter. So we would expect them to go up. And this with the traffic-related and the non-traffic, yeah, in Denmark we have a lot of sources for non-traffic contribution, as you say, wood burning, which is really popular in Denmark, especially in single-family houses in suburban and rural areas. But also we consist of a number of islands, so we also have a lot of ship, we have a lot of combustions from industry, so we have a lot of sources also for this non-traffic-related air pollution.
Final question, Francesco?
I had a question. This is Brian Hubble from EPA. So you showed a lot of results on adjusting for confounding potential, but did you also do any modeling to look at effect modification, cumulative impacts associated with green space, noise, and traffic exposures? Because I think that would also be very interesting to look at, not just the confounding.
Yeah, I only had 15 minutes, unfortunately. I could have spoken for 1 hour with all the results. These are the results from 7 papers you saw, and we have other papers also. We did a lot of effect modification with these socioeconomic variables. And we saw for diabetes, we saw effect modification for socioeconomic status. So that the higher exposure among those with lower medium education, but we didn't see actually the same picture for cardiovascular diseases.
So I was more interested, did you look at how green space access modified the pollutant exposure responses? In other words, not just the socioeconomic variables, but the actual interaction between the stressors.
We looked at effect modification, if that's what you ask about green space, and we didn't see any difference in the association between air pollution and neither cardiovascular disease or diabetes.
Francesco?
Yeah, Francesco Forastiere from Rome, Italy. Congratulations for this nice paper. You know, many of us are uncomfortable with multi-pollutant models because of the correlation. Dan Cruz some years ago proposed this cumulative risk. Have you tried to do this? It's very easy and very easy to interpret.
Yeah, we did that also. You can see all the results in the paper, but we did that also. And we also we tried different approaches with this multi-pollutant, because I agree, I'm also relatively uncomfortably with it, because you don't know what happened when you throw all of it in. But we actually also tried to look at the splines, so we added all and looked at how the splines changed for each of the exposure, and we could see that it went down, but it still had this nice linear association. So we tried to look at it in different ways.
Thank you. Now, our fourth presentation is going to be online, and it's from Dr. Haneen Khreis. She is a Senior Research Associate in Public Health Modelling at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Her cross-disciplinary research broadly evaluates the health impacts of transport planning and policy with a special interest in cities. So, welcome, Haneen.
Okay, hi, thank you, Frank. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. I'm trying to put my camera on as well. Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay, so my name is Haneen Khreis. I'm a Senior Research Associate at the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge. I hear a lot of echo, but I hope it's fine on your end.
So just
anyway, thank you. Yeah, thank you for HEI for inviting me for this presentation. And I'm really sorry that I can't be with you. I'm really disappointed as well. But ironically, I was struck by a car a couple of weeks ago in central London. So that's why I'm not in the room today, but I'm grateful that I can be with you virtually. What I'll be talking about today is a recent systematic evidence map we completed on urban transportation policies that can reduce traffic-related emissions and traffic-related air pollution. And the motivation for this work, it's already been covered in previous talks, but we know that urban areas are hotspots for traffic activity and traffic-related air pollution exposures. They're also growing. And many cities are becoming at the forefront of addressing these challenges and are undertaking several policies or actions or measures or strategies. We use all of these terms interchangeably under the umbrella term of policy interventions. And there's really a lot of evidence. There's a large evidence base of these policies or actions or strategies and their impact on traffic-related emissions and traffic-related air pollution. We also have a number of emerging technologies, which we've touched on already, but this evidence base is sporadic and it hasn't been systematically assessed or synthesized in the past, and that's why we wanted to do this work. There's been some reviews on related topics. Only one of those has reported methods a priori, and none of these has hosted results in an open access database or tool, which is a big outcome of what we've done here and hope something that will be of utility. So the results, this was a relatively big piece of work, and the results of it is they're in two papers. The first is the protocol for the systematic evidence map, which we followed throughout the process, and the second is a recent paper that analyzes and synthesizes the results, and I'll be showing some of them in this presentation today. So our research aims were to identify, describe, and summarize global evidence on policy interventions in urban areas in particular that can reduce traffic-related emissions and/or traffic-related air pollution. And emissions and traffic-related air pollution were our primary outcomes of interest. And because of that, we wanted to record the direction of the impact because of these policies. So whether these things have increased, have reduced, whether there was no change or a mixed effect as a result of the policy. We were also interested in secondary outcomes of interest or items, where we recorded whether these were looked at and what they are, but we didn't record the direction of impact. We ended up with a really large number of studies, so this was beyond the scope of this current review. But we looked at human exposures and the health effects or impacts, whether they were reported on and in relation to which pollutant and which health outcome. We looked at the range of co-benefits that were either measured, modeled, or mentioned in the studies that we synthesized. And we looked at the barriers and enablers to policy implementation as recorded in the studies. The inclusion and exclusion criteria, they've been outlined explicitly in previous protocols. And very briefly, as I said, we were only interested in urban areas or urban clusters or cities. We only included studies that had reported an impact on either emissions or air pollution from traffic or both. And we did not have any criterion about the timeline or the time scale of the policy. So the policies could be past policies, current policies, future or hypothetical scenarios that have been modeled. And all of these studies have been included in the current systematic evidence map. The articles were reported in the English language. The final search was done in June 2020. And all of the papers we included were published journal peer-reviewed papers. So we've excluded the gray literature. So in terms of results, we started with around 9,000 records, and we screened those down to 376 unique articles, which met our inclusion criteria, and those were the basis for the evidence map, which I will be showing. So within those 376 unique articles, there were over 1,000 unique policy intervention scenarios. So many studies looked at multiple or more than one scenario. And within those 1,139 unique policy scenarios, 380 of them were packages. So that means the policies were not looked at in isolation, but they were a combination of two or more policies and what we call policy packages. If you look at the unique type of policies, we had 58 types of unique policies under 6 big categories. They came from 52 countries, from 307 unique urban areas, and you can see the distribution of the evidence globally here. So as with other evidence, we see most of the policies coming from Europe, Asia, and North America, and the least number of studies conducted in South America, Africa, and Australia. Beijing and London were the cities with the most number of policy intervention studies, respectively. So in terms of those 6 overarching categories, which I just mentioned, these are the ones. So we've got pricing. These are some examples under the category. You see the examples of the most recurrent policy measure under each category. We've got land use, which was the least studied category, and things like transit-oriented development, development density and mix fall under it. Infrastructure, behavioral policies, the second least studied category, with things like public and active transportation modal shifts and promotion fall under it. And then technology, which includes alternative fuel technologies and alternative vehicle technologies, and management standards and services. Technology, management standards and services were the most studied categories. So moving forward, if we think about the full chain between the traffic activity to its ultimate measured or observed health effects or impacts, we saw that only 11 out of the 376 articles looked at all of the elements of the full chain, either measured or modeled them. And as you can see, as you go down that full chain from traffic to its emissions, to ambient air pollution, to exposure to health impact, the amount of information reduces by quite a lot. So we have a lot of information on the impact of policies on reductions of emissions, but less so on ambient pollution concentrations, exposures, and health impacts. As an example, these are the co-benefits that have been recorded in the underlying studies, and you can see that reduced greenhouse gas emissions and reduced vehicle kilometers traveled were the most cited, while things like reduced traffic noise, reduced urban heat island effect, increased green spaces are the least cited or the least studied in the underlying evidence base. So as I mentioned initially, we really wanted to come up with something that would hopefully be of utility to practitioners and policymakers and researchers and kind of help them navigate this quite complex database in a simpler way. So the first output was a queryable database, an Excel online database that is publicly available. Each row of this database has a lot of information about each policy scenario, which I don't have time to get into. But just to note that each row will have information on whether the policy scenario reduced emissions, increased them, had no change or a mixed effect across 27 different pollutants that we found studied within the database or within the primary studies. The second output was an interactive visualization tool, which we created in Tableau. It's also publicly available online. It's even a simpler way of navigating the evidence. And I just wanted to run through it with an example to make a couple of points about how to use it and how not to use it. So this is how the landing page looks like. The user can go in here and say, okay, I want to look at studies that reported on ambient concentrations of traffic-related air pollution. So I've pressed on yes here as an example. Then you scroll down to the next section. You can select or not select a country of interest. Here, I've selected the United States, just again as an example, and you can see that there's been 42 instances or 42 policy interventions or scenarios that have been studied in the United States that reported on traffic-related air pollution. So you scroll down to the next section, and then you can see what these exact policy interventions are, which ones have been most studied and which ones least studied. So you can see, for example, that vehicle retrofitting and loading, unloading, and idling regulations have been studied quite a lot under this category in the US. From the same section, you can use a drop-down menu and look at other items of interest, like I said, like co-benefits, policy enablers, barriers, health effects and impacts. And the database talks to, so the different sections, they talk to each other. So once you filter something, it will filter across all the different sections. The next section shows the direction of the impact on traffic-related air pollution and traffic emissions, so our primary outcomes of interest. You can press on no change if you wanted to look at studies that show no change, or a mixed change. I get a lot of people interested in those mixed effects. And also you can filter by the different pollutants. And then the final section would filter down the studies based on the previously kind of inputted criteria. And then you can press on any of those studies to go back to the original paper, which we do highly recommend. So as a more specific example, so if we go here with the same example, we say, okay, so which particular policies are showing us increases in traffic-related air pollution in association to their implementation? So I've pressed or clicked on traffic-related air pollution increases here, and the list got filtered. And then say I'm interested in one particular pollutant, maybe a pollutant that I'm interested in regulating, say PM2.5. So I press on that and the list gets filtered even more. You can then start looking at all these different interventions, and some of them are kind of intuitive, like urban sprawl. We can think of how that increases PM2.5. Some are perhaps slightly less intuitive, like vehicle use restriction. And that's when, you know, we're expecting some sort of user engagement. So if you press on that particular policy, you can see the two studies, the primary studies that reported that. And I went to the first one just to kind of show you an example of, you know, how this database can be used. So I clicked on this first study, which took me to the original paper here. This is a paper on Saturday driving restrictions in Mexico City to improve air quality. And the conclusion of the author was that across 8 major pollutants, that program had virtually no effect on pollution levels. But there is much more, as we all know. So if you actually go into the paper and look at all those 8 pollutants that are mentioned, there are certain reductions with certain pollutants and certain increases with others, including PM2.5, which we looked at. And there are also reports of statistical significance, which is something that we didn't report in our database. So this is the PM2.5 graphic here to the bottom left of this panel, and it shows daily data from 2005 to 2011. So as I said, we're not really reporting the magnitude of these reductions or increases, neither are we reporting their statistical significance. So I would say that this database and tools, they're meant to be starting points for users rather than try to give any developed final answers. And we hope that users who would make use of these tools can have some engagement and critical assessment of the underlying studies. So I have a couple more final slides. The first one is really to acknowledge, I think, a big limitation of this work, which is we've only looked at air pollution. We've isolated the problem of traffic-related emissions and air pollution, which is a really good start, but we shouldn't isolate the solutions. There are other pathways which we've looked at in the past, like physical inactivity and motor vehicle crashes. And some of these policies can have different impact on these different pathways, and it's important to look holistically at the impact of proposed solutions or packages on these different pathways. And this also brings up an important point that some of these policies that have promise in addressing multiple pathways, like land use and behavioral policies, they've been the least studied in the air pollution literature. While if we look at other literature, for example, right now there are the London low traffic neighborhoods, which some of my colleagues have already assessed, and we're working on assessing them holistically now. You can see that these kind of behavioral land use policies can have very positive impacts on reductions of traffic injuries and significant increases in physical activity from walking and cycling after some time of implementation, after 2 years of implementation as cited in the study. So in summary, we've created this open access database and tool, which we hope is useful for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. It's aimed at addressing some of the principal weaknesses in policy option generation and selection, which we've outlined in previous work in Europe. Some of these are listed here, like the over-reliance on preconceived ideas, the incomplete awareness of measures available and their effectiveness, and the fact that there was no systemized evidence base before this work. Limitations of this work include the recency of studies included. We've only conducted the searches up to June 2020. There is a potential for publication bias because we've only looked at peer-reviewed evidence or published papers. There's a concentration of evidence in high-income countries and on certain topics and with certain policy categories. And we have not assessed the other pathways, although we've recorded some of them in the co-benefits category, but we haven't assessed the other pathways. And I think each of the other pathways can be a systematic evidence map of its own. And just, this is my final slide. These are examples of these other pathways. So again, we've isolated the problem of air pollution, but transportation links to public health through many other pathways. And I'm just going to leave this slide on that shows some of these pathways that we've formulated and put together in this work in the past. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll stop here.
That was, to me, that sounds like chat traffic GT. And I'm just going to ask the audience, has anyone used this? Was anyone aware of it? And has anyone used this tool yet? Because I certainly wasn't aware of it. So I'm not seeing any hands go up. So one. Okay, good. Good. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot more activity on your website after this presentation. So thank you for that. So we have time for a few questions. We'll start off with Jeff.
Thanks very much, Haneen. That's, I think, something I'm going to use. It's really great, and really a lot of thought into how do you organize it. So congratulations, and we miss you here for sure. So one of the things about interventions and tracking them, which there's obviously more of that's needed, is often the time it takes afterwards to sustain your observations post-intervention to get good data. Lots of times, I guess, the proponents of those interventions, lose interest. They move on. A lot of times it's even political. They move on, and then, you lose interest in gathering the real rich data you want. But so my question is, oh, there you are, right there on the screen. My question is whether or not you were able to look at the studies in terms of that lag between, when the intervention happened, and when they started to generate information on its efficacy or lack thereof. And also if you have any ideas on, what might be done to be able to speed up that process. Because, we're all working in a faster and faster world. We want to do stuff, particularly now with decarbonization, and then show all these co-benefits really quickly. Any sense of how we could speed them up? So what do you know about that lag time that might often occur, if that was something you could stratify by, learn from, and then, ideas for speeding up intervention and actually sustaining interest in that follow-up?
Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you, Jeff. And yeah, I miss being with you all as well. So the question on the time lag, we haven't looked at that specifically because we ended up just including all types of studies together, but you can look at that question by differentiating between studies that measured the impact of the policies versus the ones that modeled. Now, most of the primary studies that we have in the evidence base, they've done modeling, they've simulated the impacts rather than measuring them. But there is a percentage, including some studies from HEI and HEI staff that measured air pollution. And I can't really speak so much to the lag because I haven't looked at that specifically. I know that we can with the primary studies, but as I showed with the London low traffic neighborhood results that some of my colleagues have done, for example, the physical activity benefits seem to have a lag, sometimes up to years, like 2 years, to see increases in physical activity as a result of that intervention. So yeah, it's an important question, and also the complexity of trying to understand the efficiency of these different policies, and how can we speed that up? Yeah, I'll have to think about that one as well. I mean, modeling is a good way to try and predict and simulate some of these effects, but the other kind of interesting aspect that we see in the primary studies is that sometimes when you do modeling, go back into the field and measure the impacts, these two things don't match up. So yeah, that combination of studies is quite important. And yeah, I think the research community has a responsibility because, like you said, with political cycles and the way, you know, governance happens in many cities, I think researchers just have a responsibility in trying to capture these events as much as possible. We're trying to do some of that work again with the low traffic neighborhood, but it's quite complex. But I'll something to think about.
Thanks, Haneen. We've got another question now.
Yeah, thanks, Haneen. Marianne Hadzopoulou here. It's nice to see you on the screen. It's really interesting that you pointed out the limited number of studies that look at land use, and I'm pretty sure you showed that chain, right, from transportation emissions, dispersion. Of course, it's easier to look at regulation because you look at the number of cars on the road and you split in half the amount of emissions based on regulation, and you look at the impacts. But land use it's so important because land use is so tied to housing. You know, big European, North American cities are growing, high rates of immigrations. Where do we build new housing? Where do we bring all of these people? And we know that where people live affects how they move around and how they behave in the city, right? And there's all of these impacts of planning, urban planning, that we really are not looking at. I mean, Regan just talked about, you know, injustice, and that's highly, highly rooted in planning. And I was wondering, you know, what are your thoughts on how do we get a handle on trying to capture the impact of zoning and development and housing and planning ultimately on, you know, air quality and health benefits or burdens?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a question we're struggling with, but we're beginning to really think carefully through it. I mean, there's been some developments in transport and household relocation and changes in jobs, employment, and life transitions. So there are new models and ways to kind of micro-simulate these things, and that's part of the work that my group at Cambridge is doing right now. Where you can like simulate populations and then follow them and have memory of their exposures and the life transitions they've had. But this is such a new development, even for us, something that we're just beginning to kind of formulate and set up in the form of models. Of course, it gets much more complex if you start thinking about following these transitions in real life and observational studies. But there's work in this arena, and hopefully in the next few years we'll see some more ideas of, you know, how mechanisms of how you can look at that.
Thanks, Haneen. We've got one. Now we've got to have one short question, and then you're going to have plenty of time in discussion, so don't worry. Short one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Haneen. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that, and I would definitely be looking at the tool and to use it. My name is Rami Al-Farra from Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute. You showed the whole range of types of categories of policies, and in the global map, of course, most of it was in North America and Europe, but there were a few examples of countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. For newcomers, for countries who are just about to start thinking about policy and interventions, did you notice a certain pattern? What type of policies are first on the list where people try for the most impact when you first start, given the huge range of options available? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't particularly remember a certain pattern, no, but there are a few studies from the Middle East, from like Cairo and Beirut, and maybe one from Jordan, where you know, some conditions might be more similar to places like Qatar. These might be good places to start, but at the same time, you don't want to limit yourself by just looking at those places. That's the whole idea of this work, is that you kind of expand the view to what's really out there and you can use. So yeah, something to think about. I'm not sure I have a straight answer, but yeah, maybe the database, the tools will help with that.
Thanks, Haneen. please stay with us because we're going to move into the general discussion now. And I think this is a very good jumping point towards thinking about the solutions, well, the challenges, and there are a lot of them, and the solutions perhaps for some of those challenges. And we're very lucky to have Dave Foster, who's going to give us some thoughts to begin with to get the discussion going. Dave is the Phil and Jean Myers Professor Emeritus of the Indian Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you probably all know Dave very well. He's been at these meetings for a long time, and he's a past member of the HEI Research Committee. So welcome, Dave.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, Frank, and thank you, HEI, for the invitation to offer my thoughts on the transportation landscape before the panel begins. So starting at really high level, it's clear we are not going to make our target goal of limiting the temperature to 1.5 degrees C before the end of the century, even 2 degrees C. The IPCC has projected that we will meet the CO2 concentration that they pegged as having to stay below by the early 2030s. So there's a new sense of urgency in terms of trying to address climate change. We will not meet the proposed rate of EV penetration into the market by 2035. It's going to be constrained by many things. The time lag for acquiring and the geopolitical and challenge associated with the increase in the amount of minerals that are needed for the EV production to meet 2035 targets. For example, it takes 250 tons of earth to make one EV battery. We will need to have 40 times increase in the production of lithium, 25 times increase in cobalt, graphite. Copper needs to be increased, about 5 times increase in rare earths. In addition, where currently these resources are being extracted and processed are in countries in which the leadership is autocratic. So that's not a pejorative statement. It's not a political statement. Perhaps it's a statement where facts are not friendly, though. So there is a lack of critical infrastructure necessary for all the charging, distribution, and wind energy and solar energy stuff. The time lag required to do those and the resources are huge. Furthermore, EVs, unfortunately, are not well suited for a large sector or significant sector of the mobility market, such as long-haul trucks, aviation, marine transport, large portions of the non-road market, and certain portions of the light duty. For example, areas where you have contractors who are towing heavy loads and trailers, to remote job sites. That's not well suited. Or if you live in a cold climate, like Wisconsin, there are a lot of challenges associated with that. So the challenges are huge. And finally, the challenge of making EVs accessible and convenient through the entire socioeconomic realm. So the upshot is that, like it or not, there's going to be a prevalence of IC engines in the legacy fleet and in the fleets being introduced for decades to come. So what are some of the ramifications of that? Okay, sorry. So we should, my thoughts, and this is paraphrased from a government report, is that we should be immediately working to implement strategies that achieve meaningful emission reductions this decade. All right. I view it as what we should really do is set a target, in my opinion, of what do we do to minimize the total CO2 emission between now and when we reach the sustainable solution, rather than saying, well, here's a target that we're going to work for, and we don't do a lot of other things that could be done now to reduce this carbon emissions from the vehicles. from the transportation system. And so for the mobility applications in which IC engine will be prevalent for decades to come, fuel is the elephant in the room. And you've heard that from a couple presentations already. But also the operational efficiency of the transportation system. And Barbara mentioned yesterday the efforts in Germany and Europe to enhance being bike-friendly and bike paths. These are great things to do. In Wisconsin, I noticed that going to the local truck store, and a lot of the people looking at electric bikes are just exploding, and they are great. It is really, really super. I'm really excited about that. But we're going to have to work with lower carbon intensity fuels, because that's the elephant in the room. And so I was very pleased when Donna talked about the efforts toward hydrogen in the HEI energy program. That's really, really important. And technology exists today to do this. I mean, John talked about the synthetic diesel fuels that are, in California. There are e-fuels, drop-ins, biofuels and stuff. Those have an advantage that they are completely compatible with the existing infrastructure. And when you start to get some lower carbon fuels, you now distribute it into the legacy fleet, and you are getting a across-the-board decrease in CO2 emissions. One that's kind of interesting is that so methanol and hydrogen, there are private sector companies that are making engines for methanol and hydrogen right now. So these could be conducive to sort of local fleet type operations and things like that. It could be very, very effective. And engine technology for doing those exists. Ammonia is being seriously considered for the marine applications, and that the known technology for a total green pathway to ammonia and the glide path is in place. And when I look at this, it reminds me of, I paraphrase a quote, from this credited to, Sherlock Holmes, when you have a problem and you're looking at the solutions, when you eliminate all the ones that are impossible, what you're left with, regardless of how unpleasant, is what you work on. And so the fact that you see the experts, the industry in the field looking at these things, it's not that they aren't looking, this is what they've come to after they've considered what the challenges are of all the other things. That for being, so from an HEI perspective, what do you look to need? So that, the impact on transportation-related air pollution with progressive, we're going to have a long progression that takes place to get to the sustainability. Likely to see fuels with an increased oxygen content. Light-duty vehicles from 2010 on are certified so that they can take up to E15. So one could start doing those sorts of substitutions. Pushing HEVs instead of electric vehicles is something that you don't hear much but makes a lot of sense. So if you have, let's say, 100 vehicle fleet, and you pull out one EV, and you pull out one vehicle and you put in an EV, well, you'll get a CO2 reduction. But with the material used to make one EV battery, you can make about 100 HEV batteries. So you could replace the entire fleet with 100 HEVs. And the payoff that you would get, normalized per unit of battery material, is about 30 to 1. BV is 1, BEV is 1, and make sure, double check that. And the HEV is 20. So in terms of per unit of battery on the vehicle, you get a 20 times larger reduction in CO2 emissions by pushing HEVs instead of EVs. Plug-in hybrids also would make sense in that in an urban area, if you have a plug-in hybrid, you could effectively just be driving an EV. You never know. But then you now have the freedom that you can go on a long road trip, and you've got the benefit of increased, better fuel economy because you have the hybrid electric vehicle. So what does all this mean for HEV? So we're likely to see fuels, increased hydrogen and methanol. Perhaps you'll see those driving, through the city and around areas, metropolitan areas and delivery fleets or things like that. And we need to look at the impact also of what happens with charging electric vehicles. And so there's a life cycle analysis study that was done by Oak Ridge Argonne National Laboratories, which showed that in the central United States, when you charge EVs on the marginal grid, or like at night, you will see an increase in PM10 because of how the electricity is generated relative to what the cars have. So there's going to be increased tire wear. Is that important or not? There's one state in the United States, I won't tell you what it is, but if you have an EV and you charge it at night, you might as well just have an IC engine, because the grid is that dirty. So the punchline to all of this is that the transition to our sustainable transportation system is going to be much, much longer than we thought, and it's likely to be very messy. So I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, David. So I'd like to open it up. We have about 15 minutes for the panel discussion.
Hi, thought-provoking set of comments there. I wonder if anyone on the panel could comment on potentially new battery technology. I don't doubt your numbers with existing battery technologies, but what's on the horizon that may change some of the dire outlook that you just discussed?
That's a very, very active research area. And there are some interesting battery technologies that are in the laboratory and that show promise, but I couldn't give you a projection of, what's the likelihood, what the technical readiness level is of those sorts of things. But I'm reminded of a quote that came from when IC engines were first started in like 1900s, when mobility systems were going, electric vehicles were being made. And someone asked Thomas Edison, said, what do you think is going to win between the electric vehicle and the IC engine? And his answer was, we need to have a breakthrough in battery chemistry before we will see that win. And so we're still working on, we're getting better. We've made a lot of progress. But so that's a really good question, and my answer is not very adequate, sorry.
Can I say a couple words? First of all, before I say, I just wanted to respond to a couple things, David, in your presentation. I think, the areas that we do agree on is that, I think the three big areas you pointed out that could be the bottlenecks for EVs, the critical mineral supply, the infrastructure, and the more difficult to abate segments like those long-haul trucks, the aviation and marine, completely agree. It's just that I wouldn't go as far as saying we will not meet. What I would go as far as saying is these are the areas that we need to focus on because we know that this is how we can decarbonize the transportation sector. In terms of batteries specifically, I want to point out a few things about critical minerals. So when you think about drilling for fossil fuels, you drill for fossil fuels once, you burn the fuel, you need to drill more. When you think about critical materials for batteries, at some stage, we have extracted all of the materials that we need, and then we recycle them. So there is an end point when we're not going to need to drill anymore. That is very far from now, okay? I'm not going to lie. That is very, very far from now. But what we have seen just in the past decade is how quickly the battery technology is improving. We're actually moving away from cobalt, and that's one of the most difficult ones in terms of where it's being sourced from, which is in the Congo. And the battery chemistries, the batteries are lasting longer, higher energy density. The costs have come way down, I think, as everyone has seen. And that's continuing to happen. And I also just want to point, on the infrastructure side, we have been also tracking, what is needed in terms of infrastructure to support all of these electric vehicles. And we know what's needed, and there's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of actually like policies that governments can put in place that we're already starting to see. I don't know if you guys track, but in the European Union, they just finalized what they call their AFIR regulation, Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation. So that guarantees every member state is going to have a certain amount of charging along all of the major roadways across all of Europe. So you're not going to have to worry about doing any long road trips in your EV. On the US side, of course, we have something similar. It's a little bit more of a carrot. We have the bipartisan infrastructure law that's also going to guarantee charging. We're putting in a lot of public funds to guarantee charging across the United States. On the difficult to abate sectors, long haul is a bit of a question mark. We are seeing the battery technology getting better and better with the potential to cover a lot of that long haul sector. And there's also the potential for hydrogen. The aviation sector, that's where we start getting into the fuels, and that's just the other point I wanted to make. The only way that we're going to be able to decarbonize the aviation sector is through the use of these sustainable aviation fuels. That's going to be the biggest chunk of how we decarbonize aviation until we get much further out and can rely on hydrogen planes. So when you think about fuels, we mentioned biofuels, we mentioned e-fuels. There's two kinds of fuels. The biofuels need to be made from truly renewable feedstocks. There is very limited of that. If you think of palm, no, you can't use that. Think of soy, no, you can't use it. These are not sustainable feedstocks. You need sort of like wastes. There's going to be a very limited amount of feedstocks that can make truly low carbon biofuel. And since we need those in the aviation sector, we should not be putting them in the on-road sector where we already have better solutions. Then when you think about e-fuels using green electricity, green electrons, you can have when you're thinking about the on-road sector, you can take that green electron, you can use it to charge a battery, or you can take that green electron and you can use it to make hydrogen and then combine it with CO2 and make a drop-in e-fuel. Using it to charge a battery is 5 times more efficient, so it doesn't make sense in most cases to use e-fuels. I agree, we want to figure out what to do with this legacy ICE fleet. There's a lot of other things we can do. For example, take them off the road, scrap them, and renew the fleet faster. So sorry, I just had to have my little spiel.
And I also want to jump in for a few points that I think are, just to add, I guess, a few points. One, when we talk about lithium, there's not enough lithium in the world for all of us to have an EV. And yes, recycling is a new frontier, great. Until we get there, I want to really call out the implications of our transition to EVs, and particularly we talk about the global south, the water-intensive, polluting mechanisms to extract lithium. That's coming to the United States, and that's mainly on indigenous lands here in the United States. So when we talk about one extracting industry, we then transition to another, and we continue to have our clean energy transition rely on the inequities of those already who had to bear the brunt of a lot of dispossession and oppression in this country. So I do want to call out that as we talk about this clean energy transition, we can call out positives in research and potential down the line, but there are very real implications today on people's homelands, indigenous reservations. And so that brings me to my second point. A lot of this conversation has been dominated around assumptions of passenger vehicles. We need to really focus on public transit. People laud the bipartisan infrastructure law. I even mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law. It is great in that, and numerically it is the largest investment in public transportation, but proportionally it is the same kind of policy that we have seen, where 80% goes towards roadways and highways and only 20% of our federal funding goes to public transit. If we are really going to have a clean energy transition, we cannot continue to have this conversation focused on single occupancy vehicles. Yes, I have my hybrid, cool, it's LA, terrible. We need to invest in public transit infrastructure. And so we cannot just say, have this kind of glamorized viewpoint that we can have this transition, we're going to recycle, things will be great. It's not, because people will continue to bear the burden of our clean energy transition. So who in here is advocating for indigenous folks? Who in here is making sure that all of us are part of this clean energy transition? And who in here is advocating to have a complete shift in our federal funding? we will not have a clean energy transport that continues to rely on a transportation system that looks like it is today, where we say, oh, we have more people, we need more highway lanes, that continues to displace folks of color, that continues to displace low-income folks, and that will continue to happen if we keep saying that all of us can have an EV. No, we cannot. And so I encourage you to really look at the nuance and complexities of this clean energy transportation system and make sure that when you're looking at solutions and you're looking at research, you remember there are real people on the ground who are bearing the consequences of all of our work.
We're running out of time, so I suggest shorter questions and we'll have some shorter comments. We have a lot to cover here.
I'm happy to defer. You can go ahead.
Go ahead, Rashid.
Hi, this is Rashid Sheikh, a former HEI staff member. My question is actually an extension to what Dr. Patterson was just saying, and that has to do with, would you make some comments on the whole issue of electrification of vehicles and the EJ communities, especially marginalized communities? And also in thinking about that, and I think what you were kind of implying, and this goes back to the previous session about participatory decision-making about road transportation and about changes to road transportation along the ways, some of the things Haneen was saying about more walkable cities and more bikeable cities, etc. So in this kind of a complex picture, and I'm very glad that you made the point about occupational exposures, which is very, very key. But in this complex picture, how do you place communities that have been overburdened and marginalized for a long time, sometimes for many generations? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I'll try to keep it brief. I'm happy to talk more at lunch. But you mentioned, I think you hit the nail on the head with participatory decision-making. And so who, as we do this clean energy future, and as was mentioned, as we have these kind of holistic conversations where you bring in housing and transportation, because we can no longer operate in silos, and we're starting to see at a federal level, HUD is now in conversations with DOT, who's in conversations with EPA. There's that new office. What's the new office? The joint office, thank you. I keep relying on you, I appreciate you. And so you're starting to see this intersectional solution making that's required. We can't just look at, oh, we're gonna have transportation. We need to say, but what are the implications for housing and things like that? But in those conversations, we need people. And so when we're looking at even creating, for instance, a new rail line, like the new K line that opened in Los Angeles, who's at that decision-making table, because who's going to be served by that? Certain homes and housing continue to be taken through eminent domain to even have transportation, public transportation built. And so the same people who were impacted by freeways continue to then be impacted by our public transportation. So making sure that the people who are impacted and the people we want to serve are at that decision-making table. They're looking at the routes that are being planned, who is being served by those. And so each solution, there's no one fits all. Each solution really is going to be very locally driven and going to really need to respond to the needs of local community. And so as we need to kind of center and situate those people first. And so we're starting to see that with more participatory decision-making in state DOTs in some places, but then you see Tennessee, which says, well, we're gonna take your farmland for a new roadway. And so we're seeing really great examples of that, but then we're also seeing dispossession in other places. But it really all comes back to centering local folks in that decision-making, and I'm happy to expand on that during lunch or at another time.
Okay, so thank you. Marianne stepped down and she said to me, ask about land use. So let's broaden that a little bit, because I think a key thing about land use would be that it's a way to initiate behavior change by doing that. And we know Haneen talked about behavior change. And I hear often from the panel here and other people, we need this, right? We need this. But we need to change the need, right? We need to change the demand. And it's always the first part, right? Conservation before digging deep into technology. And so I don't think there's an answer to this. But now I can say I'm 2 more hours off the research committee of HEI, so I can say more controversial things like this. I love being here with everybody for all of this meeting and missed everybody for all this time. But behavior changes can be things like a semi-annual conference as opposed to an annual conference, in so many ways that we can cut demand as a key part of all of our plans. And that's something I guess we all have to advocate for, and it's not easy. But I think it's just this behavior change area that is difficult, and land use is certainly one that can initiate this. But there's many others, and it's, we know, obviously reaching out to the social scientists that are really key in this area. So probably not a response, but I do get tired of hearing we need, but let's change the needs as well, and that's maybe a behavior change type thing.
And I would add, let's fund things also. If we're going to shift any behaviors, we need options. I would love if Los Angeles looked like a city where I could hop in the metro and be at UCLA instead of driving 45 minutes and sitting in traffic. It's awful. And so would my behavior change if we had funding and had funded alternative options? Absolutely. And when I say this, though, I do want to acknowledge that there are folks in cities like LA that, because of certain situations, do not have access to a car, and so I do not want to erase the people who do manage to get around big cities like LA without vehicles. However, I do want to say that for folks who have an option to, can afford vehicles, you really don't have alternatives that are viable. And so if we want to encourage behavior change, what are we funding? Because funding really shows priorities. So if we want to get people in different alternatives, where's the money to match? The US, oh, we're so dedicated to the clean energy transport. Here's a new highway. Oh, we're so dedicated to clean energy transport. Auto manufacturers, we love y'all. No, where's the public transit? And so the funding has to match the priorities. I will behavior change all day if you give me actual public transit that gets me to UCLA in under 45 minutes. And so where's the funding to match? And so for all the federal folks up in here, I'm calling on y'all for some money.
Okay, folks, it's nearly lunchtime, so that means it's the end of this particular session. You see, we've had a bit of a challenge here dealing with a topic which is really just so enormous. And if you want any confirmation of that, out on the table behind these doors, there is a report that's this thick, the TRAP report, which was the update of the transport-related air pollution, emissions and health, which HEI finished last year. We've touched on some of the aspects that were covered in that report, but there's many, many we haven't been able to. I'm glad that public transport came up in the final discussion, because we didn't. That's such an important issue, which is part of the solution. One of the things we touched on as well was the non-tailpipe emissions, which are going to be with us even with every vehicle becoming an EV. And we still have a lot of work to do there. So what basically that says to me is HEI has got a bright future ahead of it. It's got lots and lots of work still to do. And we'll still be here, well, not, some of us won't be, but a lot of you will still be here in another 20 or 30 years. But with that, I'd like to thank all our speakers on behalf of Christina and myself for the session. And please continue the conversations over lunch, and yeah, let's move this forward to more solutions.
Regan.